Haven't you ever noticed that to truly be afraid, all you really have to do is close your eyes? I'm here to share with you her story, one I had not believed myself until it was too late. When she came to me, she was just a child with what I had thought were mere nightmares. Some simple cry for her parents' attention. You don't have to believe what I'm about to tell you. God knows I didn't. But what I've learned, I feel necessary to pass on to others. If nothing else, to tell the story of a simple young woman living in what can only be described as her own personal hell. Feel free to dismiss it as delusion or whatever you will. But what I'm about to tell you is true. And the next time you find yourself looking into the eyes of your child, your lover or friend, simply be thankful that they still have them. He stood shaking in front of the window, staring out into the street below. He took another sip of his tea, the cup clinking and clattering back onto the saucer as he set it down. A drop clung for life from his lower lip, and he carelessly wiped it away with the sleeve of his crisply starched dress shirt. Sweat poured from his brow, and tears were flooding his eyes one moment and receding to revealed redness the next. The bustle around them was only matched by the circus of rush hour on the streets below. Nurses and doctors, patients and family members. It all seemed a jumble of white noise. It was, to say the least, unsettling, especially considering the circumstances. She was doing so well, he began, his deep voice trembling as he struggled to speak. She was getting better. You can't beat yourself up over this, Dane. It's not your fault, Dr. Anderson replied. He'd known Dane Welch and his family for nearly 20 years. His sister, Frankie, was here in the hospital undergoing surgery. She was found in her apartment after a distressed phone call to Dane. For years, she had suffered terrible delusions and hallucinations, as long as he could remember, in fact. It seemed she had taken a piece of mirror glass to her eyes in some final attempt to bore out the images she had always seen. It was very sad, actually. Her therapy with him seemed to be going so well. She called me. She needed me, and I couldn't even take time to help her. I just told her to calm down, that I'd be there after work. He began weeping at that point, burying his face in his hand, his back lurching with each sob. Why didn't I just go to her when she needed me? You couldn't have known, Dane. You can't do this to yourself. I'm sure she will be fine. The surgeons here are top-notch, and they're doing the best they can for Frankie. You aren't at fault for this. Dr. Anderson was doing everything he could to comfort Dane. But even he couldn't know whether Frankie would pull through or not. Frankie had always been a very disturbed young woman, and at this point, she had obviously been broken. He wasn't even sure if her mind could be repaired now if she did indeed survive. I can't understand, Doc. She's gone through this since she was a kid. Nothing like this has ever happened because of it. The things that she says she sees, the things she says she hears, she's never gone this far. Dane paused for a moment, still staring out the window, still holding his tea with a shaking hand. I have a question, and I'm not sure there's a logical answer for it. His voice shook. What is it, Dane? Anderson said in his most understanding tone, but his underlying curiosity showed through as well. How? He began, but it seemed almost as though he was afraid to finish, like the answer would be more disturbing than the question itself. How did she remove the other eye? Spokane, Washington, 22 years earlier. She just sat and stared at him. Dark circles around her eyes displayed a cruel lack of sleep for a child of only 6. She looked tired, and she looked angry. Her expression was one of pure disdain. But was it for him? Her parents? That's what he was there for. To find out what it was that was preventing this child from being a normal, healthy, and happy 6-year-old. Her head was pointed slightly down, and her eyes were cold and furious, looking up at him as he sat in the chair in front of her. The black circles made her look almost inhuman, close to evil. She held a teddy bear with a green bow around its neck in her left arm, and her hair was put up in pigtails, streaming down on either side of her little oval face, so worn and tired. Frankie, I'm Dr. Anderson. I'm here to talk with you about some problems that your parents have told me about. Do you want to talk with me? She just stared at him, those little eyes listless and trying so desperately to stay open. Your mommy tells me that you have some trouble staying asleep at night. Can you tell me why? She never moved, but finally spoke, her eyes never leaving his, the same troubling expression on her face. They won't let me, she said in a low, scratchy tone. Your parents won't let you? Anderson asked. No, them, she said as she lifted her hand lazily and pointed to something behind him. When he turned, he saw nothing, merely beige walls and a few children's finger paintings. Confused, he looked back to her. What are you pointing at, Frankie? Them, the bad things. They keep me awake at night. They won't let me sleep. They scare me, so I stay awake, she said. What are bad things, Frankie? Are they monsters? He asked, intrigued by her story. Yes, they're monsters, I think. They say things that scare me, and they look scary. I told my mom and dad, and they didn't believe me, she said, clutching her bear now. And you say they're here now? He asked. Yes, she replied, pointing again at the wall behind him. He could only think that she was having nightmares, and the fact that they kept her awake made her all the more terrified of them. She was hallucinating and seeing them now while she was awake. A delusional 6-year-old wasn't uncommon, but to this extent, it was unusual. What do they look like, Frankie? Can you tell me? She was silent for a moment, almost as though she was unsure of how to answer his question. They look different all the time, different ones, she replied quietly. This confused him even further. Normally, children put a single face on their nightmares or imaginary monsters. Very puzzling indeed. So there's more than one. Where did they come from, Frankie? They come from everywhere. I see them everywhere. Can you make them go away, please? She sounded frightened and desperate, but her voice was so soft and tired. I'm sure gonna try, sweetheart, but I need you to talk more about the problems you're having. What's going on at home? Is there any trouble there? No, not really. Daddy goes to work in the morning, Mommy goes to work in the morning, and Dane walks me to school. He pushes me down a lot, though. He's a butt, she said as she nuzzled her bear with her chin. Anderson laughed lightly and nodded his head. Big brothers are like that sometimes, but he walks with you to school, so that's a good thing. Not a lot of brothers would do that for their little sisters. I guess. Can you please make them go away now? She said it again, her voice higher now, a more sincere pitch to it. Now? We have to work to get rid of them, sweetheart, and that takes time. I mean them. She pointed to the wall behind him again. Make them go away. She began shouting, her voice frantic and riddled with fear that was impressively more profound than it had been earlier. He looked again behind him, scanned the room, trying to see what it was that frightened her so, but he saw nothing. It's okay, Frankie. I don't see anything. There's nothing bad here that can hurt you, sweetheart. He was trying hard to comfort the child. She was unresponsive to his kind words. Then, without warning, she became very still, her eyes fixed on him, the black circles around them heavy and well-pronounced amidst the unusual violet-colored iris that now seemed to peer into his very being. Just because you don't see them, Dr. Anderson, doesn't mean they aren't there. I've spoken to Frankie, Mrs. Welch, and the only thing I can surmise is that she is a very disturbed young girl. She seems to be having hallucinations about some creature she calls the bad things. I'm not sure what they're supposed to be, but they're quite frightening to her. She says that she sees them everywhere, and apparently even in my office here. Now, a concern that I have right now is how things are going at home. Is she getting enough attention and positive reinforcement from both parents? Mrs. Welch looked bemused and a bit concerned, like he was saying something to her that she hadn't heard before. We work a lot, but she gets plenty of at-home time with both of us, yes. You said something about bad things. I've never heard her mention that before, Doctor. I mean, I've seen her being stern with some imaginary friends, but she never said any names or even told me about them. What did she tell you? Is my baby gonna be okay? I mean, I thought she was just throwing fits or trying to get attention, she said lightly, her hand fidgeting with the amber pendant around her neck. She was dressed like any normal parent would be. Beige wool sweater accented by a brown suede vest. She wore blue jeans and tan stiletto heels. She looked like the average American mother. Red hair, streaking with gray, oval face, and fair features. She seemed nervous now, worrying about her child. I don't think it's an immediate concern, Mrs. Welch. Right now, I think she just needs a good night's sleep. So, what I'm going to do is prescribe some medication for her, and it should ensure that she sleeps through the night. What you'll want to do for her now is make sure that there's no added stress at home for her. She should take one of these every night before bed, and I want a follow-up appointment with her in 2 weeks, he said, trying to be as comforting as he could. To be honest, he never expected to see the child again. He thought she would get a good rest, and that would be the end of the delusions. And he would soon find out how very wrong he was. Come on, sweetheart, just take it. Dr. Anderson says it will make the bad dreams go away. Frankie just batted at her mother's hand, making the little pill fly across the room and bounce off the wall. They aren't dreams, and I don't want to take the stupid pill. It won't work. Nobody believes me anyway, Frankie said, hugging her pillow to her chest as she sat up in bed. Sweetie, it's just some bad things in your head because you can't sleep. This will help you, I promise. Why do you think I can't sleep, then? She turned her head slowly to ask her mother. The way she said it was nearly terrifying, almost like a child possessed. Her mother simply looked at her for a moment. Honey, please, just do this for me. It'll make Mommy feel better if you just take the pill, please. Mrs. Welch stepped across the room and picked up the tiny pill and held it out for Frankie. The child heaved a deep sigh and snatched the pill from her mother and swallowed it before her mother could hand her the cup of water from her bedside table. Mrs. Welch sighed and ran her hand over Frankie's head gently before kissing her goodnight. Do you want me to leave the door open? She asked before leaving the room. Frankie laid down, pulling the covers up to her chin, and replied, Do you think it would make any difference? Adrienne Welch and her husband Jeffrey were hard-working people living in the upper South Hill of Spokane, Washington. She worked part-time at a law firm doing clerical work for a stuffy, overbearing boss who liked his coffee black and his secretaries quiet. Jeffrey worked full-time at a steel mill, climbing the ladder to upper management and hating every second of it. Jeffrey worked 2 weekends a month. Adrienne was home with the kids most of the time. The way Frankie had been acting wasn't new, but neither of them could explain it. She was a very sweet and loving little girl, but over the past few years she had become distant and quiet. Adrienne donned her nightgown and climbed into bed next to her husband. She began putting lotion on her hands and feet when her husband began to speak. "What'd the quack have to say?" He snickered to her. She sighed. "He's not a quack, Jeff. He actually gave me quite a bit of insight into what could be wrong with Frankie. He was very helpful." He sat up in bed, closed his book he had been reading. Yeah. What'd he say?" "He said that she isn't sleeping, and that's what's causing her to act out this way. So he wrote her a prescription for some sleeping medication, and after 2 weeks, he wants to follow up with her." Whoa, wait a minute. Pills? He's got our kid popping pills? His green eyes flared when he said it. He was furious about the idea. Their son Dane had been on Ritalin for a year or so after a bout of hyperactivity during school. It made him lethargic and tired. After they took him off of it, he was fine. It's essential this time, Jeff. She has to sleep, and you know as well as I do that she hasn't been. Come on, give this a chance. It might work. After all, we have tried everything else, she assured him. "I don't like it. Not one bit," he said sternly. "I know, hon. But it's the best shot we've got," she said. He crossed his arms over his chest and nodded. "I suppose." Before either of them had fallen asleep, a blood-curdling scream came from the next room. Both of them jumped out of bed and ran as fast as they could to Frankie. Upon opening her door, they found her on the floor beside her bed, pulling out fistfuls of her hair. Her fingertips were tattered and bloody, and her bed was flipped upside down. She was screaming something at the top of her lungs that they could not understand. She simply kept screaming, repeating the same phrase over and over again. Her parents ran to her and held her until finally she became calm, till she was simply saying, "Make the whispers stop. Get it out of my head, make it go away." Nearly catatonic, she rocked back and forth in her mother's arms as her father rubbed her neck and shoulders gently. They just looked at each other. Something had to be done. But what was going on? How could they fix a problem if they didn't even know what the problem was? The next day they were back at Dr. Anderson's office, explaining to him the episode Frankie had the night before. "We gave her the medication you prescribed, but it didn't help. She chewed off the ends of her fingers. She pulled out fistfuls of her hair and turned over her own bed. And she was screaming in this strange language," she said, near sobbing. "My God," Anderson replied. He was completely dumbfounded by this. Going to these extremes for attention didn't add up. "What did she say, Mrs. Welch? Can you remember?" Adrian looked at him with tears flooding her eyes and running her makeup down her face. I think I can remember, but it was gibberish. It made no sense at all. Just, if you can't, repeat it to me. I may be able to make some sense of it," Anderson goaded. Jeffrey rolled his eyes and stood. "This is nonsense. Our daughter is in serious danger of bringing true harm to herself, and you're talking about what it is she said? What the hell is wrong with you, man? Sit down, Jeff. Just sit down. Don't you get it? We need help, and right now, he's the best. Adrian yelled at him through her handkerchief. Jeffrey sat down, never saying another word. She said, Niva married nicotine or something like that. I can't really remember exactly what right now, she told him. Anderson's face wore a sudden mask of shock. Color left it almost instantly and completely. Did you hear her say, Ne va muri nikio data? He said in almost a whisper. Yes! She nearly jumped off the chair she sat in when she said it. What is it? What does it mean? Anderson simply looked at them, puzzled and intrigued at the same time. Has your daughter ever taken language courses? Maybe hung around with some kids that spoke a different language? He asked, hoping there was another avenue to follow. No, she doesn't have friends outside of Dane, and she's only 6. She isn't studying any other languages. Please tell me what it means. Tell me if it means anything, Adrian shouted. Anderson sighed heavily as Frankie's distraught parents waited for some answers. Anything that would ease their minds. Unfortunately, he couldn't ease their minds. For what he was about to tell them would bring them nothing but confusion and further worry for their precious Frankie. Neva Muri Nikiodata is Romanian. He paused for a moment, wiping the sweat from his brow with his own kerchief before finishing. It means we will never die. Hello, Dr. Anderson, Frankie said as she set her purse down and took her usual seat in the chair in front of him. How have you been? I've been great, Frankie. Thank you for asking. You're 10 minutes early. We weren't supposed to meet until 11. Anderson responded kindly. Yeah, my brother is planning this thing for my birthday, and I have a few things to get out of the way. She rolled her eyes and grinned, adjusting her jacket and getting more comfortable. Ah, yes, happy birthday, Frankie. 18 today, right? Again, she rolled her eyes and smiled quite broadly. Yeah, she replied. Anderson couldn't help but notice that she kept favoring her right arm. A tell of hers that he had seen several times since she was about 13 years old. Can I see your arm, Frankie, please? He asked gently. Her smile disappeared and she suddenly couldn't look him in the eye. She focused on the table in front of her and crossed her leg over her knee, swinging it back and forth to distract herself from the unpleasant subject. I'm fine, really. Frankie, we've gone over this before. Cutting yourself is just a mask to cover underlying pain. It's not even a good mask. You're scarring yourself mercilessly for no good reason. It helps me think about something else, she responded. She still wouldn't look at him. May I please see it? Anderson asked again. She sighed and hesitated for a moment before removing her jacket and rolling up her sleeve. Dozens of scars revealed themselves several at a time as the sleeve receded until a fresh wound appeared. Not as deep as most others she had done, but bad enough that, like the others, it needed stitches, and, like the others, she probably wouldn't get them. He held her wrist and turned her arm, gently looking over the recent and previous damage. Frankie, I know you have to understand the long-term consequences of doing this to yourself, he said as he released her. Yeah, I do, but nothing else makes me feel better. And you know what I go through every day. We've been over this 1,000,000 times, she replied. So it hasn't gotten any better. You still see and hear the Darklings. But there must be other avenues, Frankie. You don't have to do this to yourself. Have you thought any more about admitting yourself into a psychiatric institution? There's some very good treatments available for visual and auditory hallucinations. She cut him off right there. I don't know how many times I have to say it, Doctor. They are not hallucinations. It's real. It's as real to me as the chair you are sitting in is to you. I didn't make any of it up for attention. I don't even want the attention it's brought me. I don't want these things in my life. Please don't coddle me and don't make me think that I'm crazy when I'm not. Stop trying to make me think that there is something, anything, in this godforsaken world that will ever make it go away. She was serious and becoming irritated with him. Then why do you keep showing up here every week, Frankie? He asked, genuinely curious. Because, Dr. Anderson, you're the only one that has ever listened to me. You're the only friend I've ever had. I like seeing you, she smiled. Anderson grinned and raked his hand through his white receding hair. I've got to get going. She rolled down her sleeve, slipped on her jacket, and picked up her purse. I have a few things I have to do. I'll see you next week, she told him as she stepped out. Have a nice day, Frankie, and be careful, he said as he waved behind her. After the door closed, he stood up, shaking his head, scratching at his salt and pepper beard. He heaved a great sigh, wondering if she would be all right, knowing that even after all these years she was still trying to find some way of coping with her problems, and even her weekly therapy wasn't a complete success. She was still haunted, but by what was still a mystery. Dane was waiting outside in the car, a metallic mint green Chrysler Cirrus. Brand new condition, even though it was about 4 years old. Dane took impeccable care of his cars, and he sat there listening to the stereo, sporting the most ridiculous pair of sunglasses she had ever seen. Of course, that was probably the point in wearing them, to make her laugh. Dane would have looked like a mix between Vin Diesel and Brandon Lee if it weren't for the bright blue highlights in his pitch black hair. He was shorter than most men at about 5'8" and weighed nearly 200 pounds thanks to a bench pressing fetish he'd been nursing since he was 16. Dane was what most referred to as a punk of sorts, but despite the rebellious appearance, he had a very successful full-time job in real estate that, if he worked hard enough, would turn into a very lucrative career. Most women would consider him quite the catch. if it weren't for those damn twirling pinwheel sunglasses. And no matter how hard she tried not to, of course she laughed. She slapped him in the back of the head on her way around to the passenger side of the car, gingerly opening the door and sitting down. "You're such a dork," she said, matter-of-factly, not even looking at him as she said it. "Yeah, but you laughed, so what does that make you?" he replied, spinning the pinwheels on his sunglasses and poking his tongue out at her. She laughed again, and he started the car, still wearing the damn sunglasses. "On to the grocery store, then," he asked as they rounded the corner on 29th Street. "Yeah," she replied, seemingly more focused on the pedestrians outside than she was on his question. She swallowed hard and closed her eyes tight, pinching her pretty face into a distorted version of what it was supposed to be. Her hands began to shake as she closed her eyes tighter and tighter. Dane pulled the car over as quickly as he could and, knowing what was happening, reached into her purse and pulled out a nearly empty bottle of Valium and opened it in a hurry. "Come on, sis. Take these." He spilled 2 pills into her shaking hand and guided it to her mouth. She nodded and took them, stealing a drink of his half-empty bottle of Pepsi to swallow them. "Just let those work, okay? Let them kick in and they'll go away." "It's gonna be fine, Frankie," he comforted her with a gentle tone and a hand rubbing her back. She wanted to believe that. She really did. "They never do, Dane. They never go away. Why is this happening to me?" She threw her hands up to her face and began sobbing, doing all she could to avoid looking outside. All she would see is the twisted faces of what were supposed to be human beings, but melting and distorted, charred versions of them. Skin sloughing off in chunks and crooked black holes where mouths would be, opening up in twisted caverns to scream at her. That was just a fraction of the horror she saw every day. And she grew more frightened of it every time she saw it. But it would be different things each time. Sometimes it was what she was seeing now, other times much, much worse. Faces that would climb out of her walls like insects, wearing horrific expressions that only violent death could bring. Sometimes what could only be described as ghosts, gaping wounds and rotting bodies visiting her at all hours with no reason. Sometimes she would wake up to something tearing at her clothes and flesh, and she would have to explain it all away by saying she cuts herself. She never had a day of peace, and how she longed for one. But the wraith-like creatures that moved in a series of random twitches and jerks in a manner far faster than the human body. Tall and thin, with mere threads for hair stringing from their bulbous heads, eyes round and beady, bulging from what should be sockets, but instead are hollow masses of blackness beneath their grayish, leather-like skin, riddled with rotting patches. Frightening faces that glare their warnings, hissing whispers that tell of things no human should know, or would ever want to know. She'd seen these things since she could remember, and they've sworn to her that they will never leave. Any of them. Ever. But why? What reason could they possibly have to haunt her so? She was just a meaningless person. She was of no use to them. How could she be? Frankie? Dane's voice broke her train of thought. Frankie, are you going to be okay? Do you need to go home and lie down or something? He sounded so concerned for her. In fact, it seemed like every time he was around her during one of these episodes, he always worried about her. Ever since they were children. I'll be fine, Dane. It's going away now. She lied. She wiped a lock of hair from her face and sat up straight, still trying to avoid looking out the windows, but trying to hide it as best she could. The grocery store was pleasantly free of more than a handful of people. It was only a bit after 2 p.m. and most folks were still at work now, only just beginning to worry about what was for dinner. All she had to pick up was a bag of choy chow mein noodles, a can of chopped pineapple, and 4 large boneless, skinless chicken breasts. Her brother must have Chinese in mind for her birthday dinner. Not a bad idea. She loved Chinese food almost as much as she loved Italian food. Her favorite Italian dish had to be stuffed shells and marinara. Something about a medley of ricotta that she just adored. She was getting tired and just wanted to lie down, but her brother had plans for her 18th birthday, and she didn't want to disappoint him. It was difficult for her to believe, but she had actually procured a small studio apartment on the Upper South Hill and was moving out of her brother's place in a little less than a week. She was surprised. She never thought she would be brave enough to venture out on her own with all the problems that she has. To be honest, she was pretty proud of herself. Terrified, but proud. In a way, she didn't want to go, but she had to see if she could do it. Even if it didn't last, she wanted to be able to say she had at least tried. "You about ready, sis?" Dane asked as they casually strolled through the aisle containing candy and chips. This was where she wanted to be right now, looking for chocolate. The Hershey's Symphony with toffee seemed to sing its way into her hand, and she said, "Ah, yes. Yes, I am." A smile crossing her face so wide he thought the top of her head might fall off. She laughed, and he laughed, and they made their way to the register. 2 people in front, 3 behind. She was beginning to feel uncomfortable being closed in that way. She took a deep breath and tried to shake it off. The cashier was friendly and courteous, making general conversation with Dane like most women did. Her hands began to shake again. She hated this feeling. Always when something was close by. And she began to hear the whispers. Random voices hissing, random words molding into sentences that made no sense to her. She began to panic. The cashier noticed it first. She asked if Frankie was okay. She needed to sit down is all. But when Frankie looked up at her, she saw the young woman smile, and her pretty face was transformed into something inhuman. Her eyes became hollow and evil. Her mouth twisted into some sickening smile that one might find on a demon. And her nose completely disappeared, leaving just 2 flat hollows. Threads of blackened skin seemed to wind over it all, completing it somehow, and of course she would make a complete fool of herself in front of an entire grocery store by screaming bloody murder and hitting the poor woman. The whispers and hisses in her head grew louder, blaring in her mind like speakers on full volume. Trying to run was a mistake. Her head was pounding so hard. She only made it a few yards before stopping altogether. Her nose began to bleed, and she could hear muddled voices behind her screaming, "Call 911. Ma'am, are you okay? Frankie, come on, talk to me, baby." Then blackness, quiet, sleep. Thank God Dane had already paid for her candy bar.